One of the more interesting assignments I had while in seminary, and I could argue perhaps the most memorable and intriguing assignment I had because I still remember it all these years later. Forgot a good part of what I read and learned, but this I still recall. It was a liturgy class, that class in seminary where you talk about not only what happens here at the altar, but about a worship service and how to provide an atmosphere where people can come and worship God. And so we do that in all kinds of ways. And on occasion, it is good to have wonderful, upbeat music to remind us that what we do when we worship and celebrate God is not just all dour, with our heads down. It is meant to be a celebration. And so it is good to be here this morning. The assignment, mystery worshiper. A takeoff from the mystery shopper kind of idea. We had to visit 3 different churches, 3 non-Episcopal churches, because we know all too much as seminarians about Episcopal churches. 3 different churches. These were the questions. What did you notice upon arriving? What did the parking lot look like? Were there holes in the parking lot? What did you notice when you walked through the door? What were the smells and the sounds? What did you see? Did anyone greet you? Did anyone answer questions you might have had? Did anyone invite you to sit near them? Or did you get the impression, good luck, go find your own place? And then this question. Did your visit, did your being at that church give you any foretaste for God's coming heavenly banquet? Whew. Think about that for a moment. Did your presence, did your being at St. Andrew's Church on January 7th at 10 o'clock, does it give you any foretaste of that heavenly banquet? Wow. Big questions. I remember one Presbyterian church I visited. In their weekly net, which I didn't call, but in their weekly net, they had a very sizable paragraph, much like the one I write. And it said, we here at this church love this way of welcoming guests. It's called the 3-foot rule. That we believe anytime someone is within 3 feet of us, if you don't know them, please introduce yourself and say welcome. If you're within 3 feet of someone you do know, please say, hi, how are you doing? How's your week been? What I remember about that is the entire morning I was there, I was within 3 feet of most everyone in the church, and no one said hello. Does it give you a foretaste of God's heavenly banquet? I visited a Greek Orthodox church. I remember the architecture because it was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. A Greek Orthodox church designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. It was called the Spaceship Church because that's what it looked like. I enjoyed the service. I still remember enough Greek that I could remember what was happening at different points in the service and what the priest was saying. But as it came time for communion, I began to rise out of my pew, and the Greek grandmother sitting next to me slapped my knee and said, no. No. And then I remembered something that comes so naturally to me to receive communion. I remembered at that moment I was not part of their communion. Did your being there give you any taste of God's heavenly kingdom? My answer was no, because I didn't get to taste at all. The assignment, while practical and helpful for any church and for all of us, not only in welcoming guests, but in welcoming each other every single week. So it had a practical purpose. It also was a reminder that what we do at St. Andrew's, all of what we do, from facets, from feeding those who are homeless, to our work with Echo, to our choir, to our FOMA music program, to our formation for young people and older, for all of what we do here, it stems from worship. It all flows from the worship of God, not the other way around. So our outreach is because we know in worship a God who first reaches out to us. It flows from remembering Jesus' words, not only to love God with all your heart, but also your neighbor. So our ministry flows from the worship of God. We give to our budget. We pledge for our budget to do ministry also as well, because of all the gifts that God has first given to us. We remember that. And even though I like all of you, even though this is a wonderful place for fellowship, and my gosh, we can throw good parties here, while that is wonderful, our fellowship one to another first is because of our relationship to God. Our worship to God, worship of God, reminds us that we do this together and not simply on our own. All that we do here flows from the worship of God. Perhaps you've noticed over the past few weeks and months that I've begun changing the prayers of the people, adapting some of our prayers. One of the sources I use was written by a gentleman named Sam Wells. Sam Wells, an Anglican priest, was head of Duke Chapel, the dean of Duke Chapel for years. He taught at Duke Divinity School. So he's written a wonderful book about prayers of the people. How do you adapt prayers of the people to make them less old and cumbersome and outdated? How do you change them to make them relevant to the world we live in? And I love how he began the book. To be in the presence of God, to be in the presence of God is humanity's purpose and destiny. To be in God's presence is humanity's destiny and purpose. The whole of Christian life, he says, all of Christian life is training for, anticipating, longing for, and enjoying the presence of God. We are here this morning. Yes, practically because we have an annual meeting following this service. We are here to hear wonderful music. We are here for formation and to be reminded of what God has done for us over all these years of the church. And we are here to see and be with friends. All that's wonderful. But we are here chiefly to worship God, to offer our prayers to God, to offer our joy and celebration and our thanksgiving and our concerns in things we are scared about and scared for. All of this to be in the presence of God. Think about that for a moment. We're here this morning, 10 o'clock, January 7th, St. Andrew's, to worship February 7th. Thank you. I've been wondering what Susan Scott kept saying to me during this whole sermon. We are here in this moment to worship God, to offer our prayers, ourselves to God. Jesus went up to a mountaintop one day, taking with him Peter, James, and John. Peter, James, and John. They went up to pray. And while they were on that mountaintop, suddenly everything changed. This light, this dazzling light appears. And they notice they're in the company of some of the older prophets. Jesus looks different. And after this whole mountaintop experience, Peter says, "You know, Lord, it's good to be here. It's good to be here. Let's stay a while. Let's pitch a tent or two. Camp out. Let's not go anywhere else. Let's not go back down the mountain with all those other people and talk about this kingdom of God thing. Let's stay right here. It's good to be here." Over all the years, I've been to so many youth group retreats, campouts, lock-ins. I've lost track of how many I've been to. There's a rather curious history with some of these weeks at youth camps. Day 1 or 2 is no one likes each other, right? Some of you young people, you're smiling. Do you know what I'm talking about? And then about day 3 or 4, then you see these youth from different groups kind of coming together and talking. And then there's a worship service at the end of the day. And by the end of the week, by Friday, when it's time to pack and go home, no one wants to leave. In fact, some youth began to cry and hug each other. "Oh, I'm never going to see you again." These days, it's much easier to keep in contact because before you ever get on your bus to leave, you can text. And text probably to the person standing next to you. When I was in youth group, I had to actually go home and write a letter and mail a letter when I wanted to keep in contact with someone. Some of you have been to monasteries for weekend retreats. I'm going to go schedule on this day to go encounter God. And most monks will tell you, if you plan an agenda and decide to go to monasteries to have an encounter with God, if that's what you plan, you're probably not going to have one. But we all have had these moments where we have prayed. Maybe it's during communion. At some point, we have this moment where God's presence is so real. "Oh, Lord, it's good to be here. Let's stay a while." The odd thing about that mystery worshiper assignment is that it certainly sounds like your worship experience is to be graded. It's not meant to be graded. So for all of you who are here this morning, all of you, please know your worship is not to be graded. God is not in the business of doing that. We who here are dressed in funny garb, the choir, the band, we are not here as performers. We're not here as performers. We are people who are trying our best to create an atmosphere that allows you and us to say our prayers and to encounter the living God. It's a temptation to want to stay. When we have those moments of clarity and those moments with God, it's really tempting to stay. But Jesus, after this worship experience, after whatever happened on that mountaintop, Jesus went back down to the mountain and went to all the villages and to all the people, proclaiming God's kingdom, touching people, feeding people. It's not enough just to stay on the mountain. We're called to go back down and to be with a world that is hurting and desperate for peace, meaning, and life. So on this day, we have our annual meeting on this February 7th. We have some things to do, some real practical things. We have a budget to pass. We have candidates to elect for new vestry positions. And all those things are wonderful, and they are good, and they are necessary for our ministry. But let us not forget that the real reason we're here is none other than to worship a living God. If we can do that, just a little bit, if in the ever slightest way we can offer our worship to the living God, it will be good to be here.